So this past week, we had our big annual 7 Marks staff retreat down in Oak Island. It was a great time, just getting away from this space and from the normal kind of rhythms and routine of work and life, and just being able to look back and look ahead. You know, it gives us this chance to just reflect on the last year and see the goodness and faithfulness of God in our church, and to look back as individuals and teams and see how we did on our various goals and initiatives as a staff. But then once you kind of have the past and what's happened firmly in your mind, you start to pivot and look forward and begin praying and dreaming about what God might want to do here at 7 Marks over the next year. It's really profound. There's something about getting away, right, that allows you to look back and to look forward, to reflect and to dream. And to be honest, in the busyness of everyday life, that is a mindset that's really hard for me to get into. And so after these retreats, when inspiration is struck, I always love to capitalize on the moment. So one of the things I started doing, I created a little ritual for myself a few years ago. At the end of these retreats, on my way home, I take a detour from Oak Island, and I go in to spend a little time in the city of Wilmington. Some of you know that I lived there for 4 years while I was getting my undergraduate degree from UNCW. And on the one hand, at the surface level, it's kind of fun to go back. It's cool to see how the city's changed and see how campus has changed since I was there, but that's not really why I go back. Believe it or not, I go back so that I can see how much I have changed. And that may sound strange, but here's the deal. Like going back there, it's like returning to a previous moment in my life. It's almost hard to describe what happens when I drive down those old familiar roads, when I hit those old familiar sidewalks. It doesn't matter how much things have changed, how much progress has happened. I am viscerally pulled back into the past. It's as if I'm able to watch a previous moment in my life frozen in time. And this moment is to me at the same time so familiar and yet at the same time so foreign. As soon as I step on campus, I begin to think, like I can remember how I felt as an 18-year-old, like so independent now, so competent now. But then in my 30s, I walk around and I'm like, man, my parents basically paid for me to live at like a private resort for 4 years. These kids have no idea what's going to happen to them when they leave here. I walk past the dining hall where I can just feel, I can remember how much I hated going there every day. But now I can't remember why. Because at this moment in my life, I would do just about anything to be a stone's throw from decent food that I do not have to prepare myself. I walk past the library and the buildings on campus and places where I used to study and write and learn for countless hours. And I can feel how anxious I used to be and how busy I always seemed to be. But then at the same time, I look back and I'm like, man, I would do just about anything to be as busy now as I was back then. That would be great. And then I start to think about relationships I forgot I had. Decisions I forgot I had made. Ideas I used to think were so important. Things I used to think I cared so much about. Careers I just knew I was going to pursue. And it all seems so familiar to me. But then I start to think about that kid who lived there for 4 years. He didn't know my wife. He didn't know my kids. He didn't know any of the things that I know now. He didn't care about most of the things that I love now. And it all seems so foreign, so foreign. And the more I reflect, the more it seems like what I'm actually looking at is two completely different people, two completely different stories, as if they have nothing in common. But that is an illusion, because I'm not looking at two people and two stories. I'm looking at two moments in the same story. And that's the value of going back. You see, by going back and honoring a previous moment in my story, I gain wisdom for the present and future moments of my story. Taking a look back is one of the ways that I get perspective on the whole narrative of my life, with more nuance and clarity and confidence and depth to walk into the future. But, and this is really important, I don't honor the moment by just going back and trying to drag it into the present, duplicate it, replicate it, whatever. And I definitely don't honor a previous moment by forgetting it ever happened or ignoring all of the important things that I learned along the way. We honor the moment when we go back in order to bring its wisdom forward. Now, if you're wondering, why on earth am I telling you about this weird habit I have going back to school for a day? The answer is that something like that is the answer to a question that you've probably been asking since you found out we were doing a series on Leviticus. And the question is this: why on earth are we doing a series on Leviticus? Leviticus is foreign, right? 19,000-word document written in ancient Hebrew about events that took place around 3,500 years ago. Some people have called Leviticus a priestly technical manual because that's really how it reads. It's full of ritual sacrifices and blood and bodily fluids. There's a lot of weird, confusing stuff that we don't really understand at all. For a lot of us, Leviticus is most famous for being the book that derails our Bible in a year plan. You get into Genesis, right? The mystery and the intrigue, the Abraham story, the Joseph story, we love that. And then you roll right into Exodus, and we've got murder and sabotage and intrigue and chaos, and you've got Moses versus Pharaoh, and then you've got plagues and redemption and crossing the Red Sea. Exodus has it all until you get to about chapter 25, and then everything kind of grinds to a halt. We start to read painstakingly specific details about the building of a tent, of all things. And then just when you think you're through the worst of it, Exodus doubles down. And you get a painstakingly specific account of the building of that tent in accordance with the painstakingly specific account that you just read. And then when you can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel, you flip the page to Exodus and oh no. Painstakingly specific details about butchering animals and ritual sacrifice. And we're out. Yeah, Leviticus is definitely foreign to us. But the big idea behind this series is that Leviticus shouldn't just be foreign to us. It should actually also be familiar to us. You see, while it may seem on the surface, definitely, that Leviticus is telling a completely different story, that is an illusion. It's actually just a different moment in the same story. The story of God's pursuit of his people, the story of God's desire to dwell in the presence of his people. And so when you frame the story that way, what you see is it's not two different stories, it's just two moments in the same story, which means we can go back. Because by going back and honoring a previous moment in the story, we can gain wisdom for the present and future moments of the story. Not by just going back and dragging it into the present, trying to duplicate everything that we read, but also not by ignoring it and pretending like it never happened in the first place. We go back in order to find wisdom and bring it forward into the present. I love this from Dr. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project. He says, these texts are designed to produce people who live with wisdom, justice, righteousness, and the fear of the Lord, resulting in the blessings of Eden in my life and in the life of those around me. And so if that's true, man, I think Leviticus is worth our time. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to go back, and we're going to make Leviticus a little bit more familiar. Not the whole book, but specifically the sacrificial system introduced in the first 7 or 8 chapters. The purpose of this series is not to turn our church into a graduate level seminary class, though you may disagree with that at some points in the weeks ahead. The purpose of this series is not to just make our church smarter, though of course I hope that happens. The purpose of this series is not our creative way of telling you that we're going to start doing weird things with blood and animals, and except for maybe cats. That's a joke. That's a joke. Come on, that's a joke. The purpose of this series is the purpose of every series we do at 7 Marks, to help us practice the way of Jesus together. So we're going back. And the hope is, prayerfully, that we'll be able to shed light on parts of the Bible that normally confuse and scandalize us. And that by shedding fresh light, we might gain some perspective for our moment, right now, and into the future. So, On the docket today, the only thing that I want to do today is just kind of name some of the barriers that you and I are going to have to deal with and overcome to engage this material. And then I just want to set the category, set the themes and the theology that we will need in the weeks ahead as we unpack the sacrificial system. So you ready? Can we do it? I think we can. Are you excited? Okay. All right. Well, here we go. So the first barrier that you and I are going to have to overcome is that, man, this is boring. This is boring. And listen, I get it. I get it. You flip into Leviticus, or really the Torah in general, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And, if we're honest, there's a lot more genealogies and censuses and building codes and laws than we normally prefer in our quiet time. I'm right there with you. I've been sitting with this material for weeks. I am genuinely excited about this series. I think God has something for our church. But it is still not the most exciting thing for me to sit down and read in the world. I'll just be honest with you. But that doesn't mean it's not worth our time and attention. As one commentator says, he says, it may be argued with qualifications that no book is more relevant for understanding certain aspects of the New Testament. Leviticus provides the foundation for understanding the gospel. It's really worth our time. But assuming that you can actually sit down and get yourself to read this material, the next problem, the next obstacle is that it's baffling. We just don't know what we're reading. I don't know what we're supposed to do with most of this stuff. This is true in a lot of cases. In fact, there's one of the most classic, famous examples, not in Leviticus, is this gem from Exodus chapter 23. The best of the first fruit of your soil you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. We get that. Yeah, I can see where you can find some wisdom for that. But then this. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Life verse, anybody? Man, if I had $1 for every time I quoted this passage in a meeting with somebody, whew. But seriously, do we need that? Did God really say that? Did God really need to say that? Apparently so, because it gets said multiple times in the Torah. Apparently it needed to be said, and this is important, in their context, in their moment of the story. We sit thousands of years removed from all of that. We should be baffled sometimes by what we read. That's not our moment in the story. The Torah is not written to us. It is written to a specific group of people in a specific set of circumstances at a specific moment in history, and that's okay. It just means, not that it's irrelevant, but that when we come to these texts, the primary lens through which we must read them is that we are looking for wisdom. That's the primary lens by which we must approach these texts. Love this from John Walton, Old Testament scholar. He says, just as Israel in the Old Testament was identified as the covenant people of God, through whom he would carry out his plans and purposes, so in the New Testament, the church is co-identified with God as the body of Christ to carry out his plans and purposes. The Torah provides wisdom to the Israelites to help them understand what their co-identification should look like as God carries out his purposes and plans through them in their time and culture. The Torah was not given as God's revelation to help the church be the church. It was given to help Israel be Israel. But he goes on to say, if we have learned what Torah was and how it functioned, we will be able to use that understanding of God's plans and purposes to gain insight into how they are being carried out today through the new covenant. And then he says, what we can learn from Torah is important, but we are not participants in that program. Which brings me to the third thing. If we're primarily here for wisdom, then what on earth are we supposed to do with all of the stories and the laws and the practices that not only baffle us, but to be honest, they kind of embarrass us? Like, there are times when this material feels barbaric. There are things taken for granted in these pages of the Bible that we abhor, that we debate today. Things like polygamy, patriarchy, capital punishment, slavery, war, genocide, conquest. Like, what do we do with all of that? And I get it. And if we were coming to a part of the Bible that was describing God's ideal society, if we're reading the story about God's preferred cultural expression, then yeah, we have an insurmountable problem on our hands. But fortunately, that is just not what's going on here in the Torah. To quote Walton one more time, he says, Israelite society needed to be a more or less ideal embodiment of social order by the standards of the ancient world. In other words, the whole point of the covenant is that God could make Israel a revolutionary example of what life looks like in the presence of God in their moment. The point of Torah, God's desire in the Torah, is not to make ancient Israel into 21st century modern Westerners. That's just not what's happening. The desire of God in the Torah is to find sinful people where they are, to meet people where they are, to work with them as he finds them so that he can transform them and then through his transformed people bless the world. And isn't it interesting, when you frame the story that way, doesn't it sound a little bit more familiar? Doesn't it sound a little bit more like the story that we are living out right now ourselves? There's a lot more I wish I could say there, but we got to move on. The last obstacle that I think a lot of us are going to face in this series is that when we read this, it honestly, it feels like we're taking a step backwards. See, a lot of us have this tendency to kind of play the Old Testament and the New Testament off against each other like they really are fundamentally at odds, like they're just completely different stories. I think the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that was like works righteousness, and the New Testament is all about justification by faith. The Old Testament was law, and the New Testament is grace, and that is wrong. That's just wrong. The Torah, especially Leviticus, is precisely not the story of how people are earning righteousness or earning salvation. To borrow a phrase from the Apostle Paul, it's the story of God's people working out their salvation with fear and trembling because they are in the presence of God. This is such an important point. I want to camp here for a second because if you don't get this, we won't be able to move forward in this series. You have to understand, especially the two big themes of Leviticus, sacrifice and holiness. Sacrifice kind of frames chapters 1 through 16. Holiness is really 17 through the end of the book. So let's talk about holiness for a second. Holiness comes to us, one of the most important passages in Leviticus is chapter 19, verse 2, and it says, "Be holy, because I, the Lord, your God, am holy." You probably heard in church before that the word holy means set apart, uncommon, pure, maybe even divine. God is holy, and so anything or anyone in proximity to God or associated with him must be made holy. But Leviticus is not the story about people becoming holy just by obeying the law and performing these rituals. There's something a lot more profound going on here. Michael Morales, whose book on Leviticus has just blown my mind, he gives this helpful picture. He says, just as basking in the sun's light brings color, warmth, and health to the body, so basking in God's presence brings holiness. That is gradual sanctification. While Israel is called to keep laws, he says, doing so did not make the people holy, but rather prepared them to be made holy by Yahweh's presence. And this is the critical point. It is this startling reality, he says, that Israel may draw near to the maker of heaven and earth through the sacrificial liturgy that unravels the theological knots. To the degree that Israel submitted to the program of worship, to that degree they would be made to ascend to God. Israel was to pursue holiness by pursuing God. This is the framework for the sacrifices that we need. It's what Morales calls a program of worship. It's a plan of action given by God. See, in the logic of Leviticus, God has already drawn near to his people. And the sacrifices then are a gift he gives them to help them learn how to draw near to him. In other words, the sacrifices are rituals through which God transforms his covenant people who are destined to be a blessing to the world. Or to put that in language that's a little bit more familiar to us, they are practices through which God transforms his covenant people who are destined to bless the world. Now, if you're still with me, your eyes haven't rolled out of the back of your head from confusion or boredom or whatever, let's dig in and see how that works a little bit. So one other thing we have to talk about before we move forward, one other thing we have to get our arms around if we're going to make any progress in this series is this. This is the tabernacle. We'll talk more about it in the coming weeks. I just want to introduce it to you today. It's sometimes called the tent of meeting. This is the epicenter for Israel. This is the epicenter of the program of worship, the sacrificial system. But it's not just that. To really understand the significance and the importance of the tabernacle and what's happening as these sacrifices are being brought on a regular basis, you have to go back even further to a previous moment in the story. Actually, to the first moment into the story. This is the Garden of Eden. You see, in Eden, the Garden of Eden is presented as really the summit of the mountain of God. This is the place where human beings are able to dwell fully and freely in the presence of God. As we all know, though, sin derails it, defiles the humans, and they're cast off the summit of the mountain, expelled from the garden, away from the presence of the Lord. And once they're outside the garden, all hell breaks loose. Adam and Eve's children, one Cain kills his brother Abel, and the Bible says that God sends Cain even further eastward, out of not just the garden, but now out of Eden altogether, down the mountain, away from the presence of God. Flip a few pages, a few chapters in Genesis, and you come to the descendants of Cain, and they decide that they will build the Tower of Babylon, a kind of mountain, so that they will be able to ascend back to God all by themselves. God responds to this by confusing this, a familiar story, confuses their language, and he scatters them even further to the east, off the mountain, into the wilderness, as it were, further from the presence of God than ever before. And the story the Bible is trying to tell is one of from life in the presence of God to death in exile, from the summit of the mountain to the wilderness, from Eden to Babylon. That is our story. That is our life. And the fundamental question is, can we ever get back? Can we ever make it back? Or as the psalmist says, "O Lord, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy mountain?" And the point is this. When we think about what's happening at the tabernacle through this program of worship, through these sacrifices, what we're supposed to be thinking is that the sacrifices are the way into the tent, and the going into the tent is to symbolically ascend the mountain of the Lord, to get back into the Garden of Eden, back into the life and blessing of the presence of God. And so with that in the back of your mind, let's actually get into Leviticus here for a minute and just see how all of this actually works. So after the Garden of Eden, after the Tower of Babylon incident, people have been scattered into the nations, but God calls one man, Abraham, out from the scattering. He invites him to come back west, back towards the mountain of God. Abraham, you probably remember, he's the one that God makes a covenant with and says, "I'm going to give you a family, and from your family, the nations are going to be blessed." And we don't have time for this today, but hint, hint, there's a significant moment in Abraham's life at the top of a mountain with the sacrifice. But centuries after Abraham, the promise is realized. The family has become a nation, the nation of Israel. But we have a new problem in the story. The nation of Israel is in exile. They are slaves in the land of Egypt. But through a new leader named Moses, God redeems his people, brings them through the waters of the Red Sea and through the wilderness, and they come to the base of a mountain, to the base of Mount Sinai. And when they get there, we are told that the glory cloud of God descends and comes to rest on the top of this mountain. And that because of the proximity the people now have to God, no one is able to ascend the mountain except for Moses. Moses goes up and dwells in the presence of the Lord. It's here that he's given the 10 Commandments and the instructions for the tabernacle. Watch this. Moses comes down the mountain. Stuff happens we don't have time for today, but they eventually build the tabernacle. And when they do, the glory cloud, the very presence of God himself, comes down from the mountain and fills the tabernacle, making it a kind of mobile mountain of God. The tabernacle becoming the gift of the presence of the Lord to his people, the way that they can ascend the mountain, the way that they can return back to life in the garden. But there's another problem. Exodus ends on this ominous note. And the cloud covered the tent of meeting, just as it had the top of Mount Sinai, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is great news. Oh, and Moses could not come into the tent of meeting, for the cloud abode upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Isn't that strange? Moses, like a couple of chapters ago, was in the presence of the Lord at the top of the mountain. He was there. But he comes down the mountain, the presence of God fills the tabernacle, and all of a sudden, Moses can't go in. And we have this meeting tent now that no one can meet with the Lord in. What are we going to do with that? And that's exactly where Leviticus picks up in chapter 1, verse 1. And the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. This is the Lord calling out because nobody can come in. No one has access to the presence of the Lord. So God calls out and he begins to tell them how they can come in. Now, with that in mind, let's look at one more verse. At the end of Leviticus, we get to Numbers, the next book in the Bible, and this is what it says. And the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year. You see what happened? Moses got in. Moses got into the presence of the Lord. How? What changed? Well, that's what the sacrificial system of Leviticus is all about. And once God gives them this sacrificial system, the first 8 or so chapters, we read this in Leviticus chapter 9. It frames everything for us. Aaron, who's the brother of Moses, he becomes the high priest of this tabernacle, lifted his hand towards the people and blessed them. Then descended from offering the purification offering, the ascension offering, and the peace offerings, which we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. Moses and Aaron entered the tent of meeting, and they came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people, to everybody. Mike Morales sums this all so beautifully. He says Leviticus is not merely offering tedious ritual instruction. It is narrating a theological story. Leviticus begins with Israel standing outside the cherubim-guarded entry of Eden. If Moses the mediator may not enter, then how will it be possible for the tabernacle to become a tent of meeting between God and all of Israel? With the opening verse, the God who dwells within begins to speak, revealing the way of entry, the way back to the tree of life. To understand Leviticus, then, is to understand the way of Yahweh, the way of life. Worship through sacrifice was a journey into the presence of God, a rite of passage in the sense that the journey involves a process of transformation and consecration. As we said earlier, they are practices through which God transforms his people so that they can bless others. Now again, just to remind you, this is not our moment in the story. We are followers of Jesus. And Jesus, spoiler alert, is where the story was going all along. Jesus is the new and better Adam. He is the one who is able to dwell in the presence of the Lord fully and freely because there is no sin in him. Jesus is the new and better Moses, the mediator, the one who can represent God to his people and people back to God. Jesus is the fulfillment of the first covenant that's explained in the Torah. He does this by becoming the true and better sacrifice that Leviticus was always pointing to. And through that, he inaugurates a new covenant, a new relationship, a new way to be the people of God, a new way to ascend the mountain and dwell in the presence of the Lord. And this is what's so interesting. This is so cool to me. At the end of the Gospels, we are told that when Jesus does all of this, when he finishes the first story and he introduces the new moment in the story, that he ascends up into the heavens, back to his Father, to sit at his right hand and receive his royal authority. But then it says, we're told, that Jesus sends the Spirit of God down. The indwelling, powerful, personal presence of the Spirit of God is sent down from the summit to dwell in the tabernacle of our bodies. And now, in and through the Spirit, you and I have uninterrupted, perpetual access to the presence of the Lord. in and through the Spirit, we are being transformed into the image of Jesus so that he can use us to be a blessing in his world. Oh Lord, who can ascend the mountain? Well, thanks to Jesus, you can. And I can. Oh Lord, who may abide in your tent? Well, because of the Spirit of God, you can. And I can. So what are we saying? What are we proposing with a series on Leviticus? That we go back. We go back to a previous moment and we look for the divine ideals underneath this whole system of sacrifice. What's the theology being worked out through these various sacrifices? What's the story being told as the people bring these sacrifices? Who are they becoming as they regularly offer this program of worship in the presence of God? And is there any wisdom for us? Is there any wisdom from their moment in the story that might help us in our moment of the story to more faithfully and fully dwell in the presence of the Lord? That's the question of this series. And again, the point is not to go back and just drag their stuff forward. It's not wisdom. It doesn't honor their moment if we just try to replicate or duplicate their rituals and their symbols and their practices. But it's also not wise to ignore them altogether or act like we are so advanced that we don't need our own rituals and symbols and practices in order to experience life in the presence of God. Love this from Tish Harrison Warren. She writes, most of our days, and therefore most of our lives, are driven by habit and routine. Our way of being in the world works its way into us through ritual and repetition. We are shaped every day, whether we know it or not, by practices, rituals and liturgies that make us who we are. Whoever we are, whatever we believe, wherever we live, and whatever our consumer preferences may be, we spend our days doing things. We move in patterns that we have set over time, day by day. These habits and practices shape our loves, our desires, and ultimately who we are and what we worship. She's exactly right. Our habits and our practices, our sacrifices in a sense of meaning, are the way that we root ourselves in a particular point of view. Our practices and habits, they point us in a particular direction. They graft us into a particular story. They calibrate our hearts towards certain longings and loves and desires. And eventually our practices are ultimately what determine the person we become. And so the question for all of us today and the rest of this series, the question is always, who are we becoming? Who are we becoming? Are we experiencing the fullness of life on offer? Are we experiencing life in the presence of God? Are we being transformed? Are we becoming a blessing to others? Another way to say that might be, are we becoming the kinds of people who can love God and love people well? Which is, by the way, what Jesus said the whole point of the Torah was in the first place. And if our answer to any of those questions is not one we're content with, then it may be time to look at our habits and our practices and our rituals and our routines. And if we have eyes to see, that's exactly what Leviticus is going to enable us to do. And so we're going to go back for the next few weeks and look at these sacrifices and see if there's not just some wisdom from their moment in the story that might help us in our moment of the story, as we all anticipate that ultimate future moment when, as Isaiah says, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the summit of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. And the nations shall flow to it. Many peoples shall walk and say, come, and let us ascend the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. From out of Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. O house of Jacob, O church of Jesus Christ, come and let us walk in the Lord's light.